So Nadia, Marshall, Christine, thanks so much for being really provocative and helping us to go after lunch. and as someone was telling before, if this is the future, it's really good. So I would like to start more than with questions with some ideas that I had before, but mainly that raised with your talks. And the first one, I would really like you to talk about how do you manage and engage teaching, practice, research. How did you change and move when relating with the students, clients, sponsors? How is your work engaging all those three different kinds of production modes?
I'll start. So our projects are obviously dealing with cities and often municipalities, and that's usually their starting point. But we're very adamant that this is also a research lab, and we're not going to be, I guess, told what to do. It's about kind of brainstorming and putting an idea of the future forward. There's always kind of conflicting interest, but I think we can manage that gap through a process which includes intense brainstorming with students and professionals, continuously bringing people from the outside. We had someone from the Smarter Planet IBM initiative come last week. We've had people from Cisco come, and really try and play between these two worlds of what is practice, what is theory, and what we can get out there.
Yeah, the same. I was kind of interested too what you were doing with the trust tracking, because it was this idea about showcasing the idea of information that really affects our city, the potent forces that really affect it, but are not normally shown. And the idea was also to develop this in a way, this kind of information, in a way that attracts also the general public, right? To make information exciting. And to some extent, even some of the images I would say that I was talking about before with MVRDV, is they actually kind of dramatize. They make the information quite dramatic. And I wouldn't say they falsify the information, but in some cases, certain aspects of them have to be, I guess, exaggerated to get the point across, right? And one of the images that I showed of their work was these kind of compelling mounds that kept growing and growing if the city didn't recycle, and it kept growing, and there was this density change. And so they're almost these kind of shocking images, but they are readily available. They get the message across, similar to a painting, for example, that needs to be done. And in terms of in the studios or even in the courses, it's this idea that I even ask the students to actually design with data, like be inspired by it. And how do you kind of take that and actually draw, for example, a scape or a landscape from it? And so it's that kind of other level of not just designing with, typical kind of plazas and urban spaces, but actually how to get that initial run before you get to the actual final design of the spaces.
I would say for me, it has to do with what really helps is having a conception and approach to urban design and architecture as well as being not so much disciplines, but being discourses. So in that sense, I find it not difficult at all to transition sort of seamlessly back and forth between, pedagogy, research, and practice, because, if you view our work as I do, as the work of communicators, translators, negotiators, whether it be between a model and a drawing, or between a contractor and a client, et cetera, between a politician and a community activist, it makes that very easy. So in the design studio, for example, the mashup exercises become a way for me to immerse the students, one, in the making of pictures, which is, for the most part, our stock and trade as designers. Number two, to actually engage history in an active way. So I ask them to do exercises, for example, where they have to make a plan either of a building or something larger, where they're not allowed to draw, simply. So they have to literally take Corb or Mies, or both at the same time, and cut them up and put them together in some new way. In practice, for me, that becomes that same methodology or way of thinking becomes, at least so far, a kind of escape from a certain pressure or responsibility to decide everything on my own, to actually engage in almost a kind of, trans-historical conversation with those that have come before me, or even those who are around me, to solve problems.
And it's also, we're in a media saturated culture, and so we have to kind of use these new technologies and our disciplines as architects or landscape architects or urbanists with artistic license to showcase this kind of information about urbanism in the future, right? And also the idea about mapping, like there was even much discussion about it before, is earlier kind of quotations from James Corner, who's a landscape architect, he really talked about the idea of mapping as this kind of creative process. And the idea of design is creative. And so if we could take a step back and take things that really influence our city, like land use planning, crime rates, and even surveillance cameras, and all these kind of prevailing forces, and somehow put them in a way that the images really evoke some kind of future of the urbanists. I think that's kind of important, especially in today's age.
So I think the other thing which is going to be really difficult increasingly is that we now have access to so much data.
Yeah.
We're not just dealing with a snapshot of census data we could get from 10 years ago. We're dealing with hundreds and thousands of entries, whether that's cell phone entries or it's trash tags or whatever it is. And this new language of visualizing complexity, visualizing how much data and who you're going to work with as well. I think this forces us to work outside of our conventional boundaries. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sort of lack of self-esteem amongst the members of our field about the value of the images and the pictures that we create. But I actually found out pretty quickly the power that pictures have, especially when you start getting involved in things like contentious development battles, because there's this sort of standard practice, especially among developers, that if you want to get something done, what you do is you shut up about it, right? You don't show it. You keep it invisible. And so the way that we can make either visualizations of things that are either ephemeral or mobile, or even alternative possibilities for things that haven't happened yet, is really kind of incredibly powerful, especially in regard to some of the discussions that have happened about how do we intervene in terms of achieving urban justice, or act or these kinds of things in sort of how do we engage or attain some agency in public debates. I think that there, in no small measure, are the visualizations that we create have a big role to play in that. So, I think then it's on us to think about those visualizations more critically as people are doing here.
Well, what I was thinking it was very interesting is that some way you were trying to overcome traditional ways of representing the urban. All of you.
Yeah,
okay. You were not only using technology to create maps. In some of your explorations, you are trying to push even farther and try to use some of the fabrication opportunities that we have. And we are pretty proud in here. We have a wonderful fabrication lab, and some of those opportunities emerge as a great move forward, because those allow people to not only see but also touch, and they bring into the table a completely different way of engaging with some of the proposals and some of the visualizations that we are trying to convey.
And it's also kind of getting it readily too, and at that moment, for example, like the image she was showing with where's the party at, that was kind of interesting. And one animation that I didn't show was actually looking. We were kind of examining Church Street in Toronto and doing this kind of thing of the queer city, and looking at kind of the hours of operations of specific venues, and the buildings themselves, as more people entered into certain establishments, the actual buildings began to glow, right? They became almost like light switches, and the more that they began to have these kind of bright lights with them, it almost had this kind of connotation that there was something more involved or more people happening at that spot. And so people who were working on this project were looking at, okay, so if there's more people attending certain venues at this time on these specific dates, then perhaps we need to build, I guess, supportive venues that could kind of balance the two. So these are the kind of things, like it becomes a parity between the actual information and then final, like the built forms afterwards.
There's a continuous feedback loop,
Yes.
I think, with all of that. In some ways, though, I think we're not trying to overcome traditional techniques of urban mapping. It's complementary, and what computing has done, I think a computer is not just a tool to do what a human does faster. A computer is a device which can suddenly do things that a human can't do at all. Can't process that information in that time. So it's a complementary process, and I don't think it takes away from the traditional technique of drawing or understanding through whether it's mashup or whether it's more collage or whether it's more sketching out the city.
But I would say that there are still things that we can do that the computers can't do
Definitely.
either. So.
Yeah, it works both ways.
Yeah.
That's why it's complementary.
And that comes to the point, because as architects or urban designers, you have this amount of information, but we essentially then pick and choose what we want to show. In some places, yes, certain maps are true, but in certain cases, you can't showcase everything, and it becomes false in one sense. So you have that kind of dual or conflicting notions of them. And again, like in terms of design, when you design with data, you have the aspect of showing what you want or not want to want, and that's kind of important too in terms of the drawings or the visualizations.
But I also was interested in your position with animations as a way of only showing not only the final stage, which is sometimes one of the main issues that we have to deal with, but also show an understanding of how things are moving forward process. Sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's for failure, but that ability of animations to also overcome this final image fix, and that's what it is, and may not happen at the scale that we may end up being designing. I find that pretty interesting too, as another way of pushing forward the traditional
I mean, I think there's this fundamental hang-up that those of us who graduate from architecture to urbanism have to get over, which is that in urban design and in urban scale practice, I think it's not about kind of getting the commission necessarily in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. It's not about necessarily the money shot. In many cases, we don't get to design the buildings or the landscapes which we are trying to, let's say, stage or orchestrate. So for me, this is a very fertile ground of investigation in terms of thinking about representation. How do you not show the monster, right? This thing that in the best monster movies and the best horror movies, the best ones are the ones where you don't see the monster, right? But you understand that there's something going on, and you're sort of so for me that is the question about these, either these sort of photo montages or the animations, how it gives a sort of narrative about some techniques and some processes for how, a site or a city or a project might establish itself or might grow over time or might change over time, rather than saying that, okay, this is what the thing is and this is what it's going to look like. Because I think when you're doing urbanism right, you don't necessarily know.
Slightly different, but I think it was pretty clear in your presentation, Christine, when you were pretty much telling us how many different disciplines are working together in the lab in MIT. How unique is that environment? How easy?
I think it's fairly unique.
How challenging is it to work in that environment?
Well, I think it comes from the approach of the lab, which is not necessarily to work incrementally, but to really work with a city to find a problem. And problems don't fit in one category, in one discipline. Problems need many people involved. And I think, that's why we have many people attracted from many different places. For me personally, it was great. And, you know, learning the language. I was working specifically with the bike and working with a mechanical engineer, an electrical engineer, computer scientists, people who, you know, do network analysis and visualize data. And you have to learn a new language, but that's key to it. But it all comes because you have this problem that you're working towards, and you recognize that it needs a number of players to get something that you want done. So,
in your experience, it's easy to find those kind of collaborations in teams in professional practice, or?
Yeah, I think so. One step that we're looking at right now with these kind of maps is to bring it to more of a global mass. And so the thing is right now I'm working with software engineers and other disciplines and people who are more immersed in the technology sector. So you have to, as Christine says, get into their mind frame, right? Because in some case, they're all about, you know, the core numbers, and as designers, you want to put that aesthetic quality to it, or that kind of, I guess, visual power, similar to what Ferris was showing, but he was using charcoal medium at the time, but now we have different technologies that fortunately we're allowed to show to the masses. And so kind of working with different disciplines, and of course architects and landscape architects, you know, they may be more at the same kind of level, but when working with more computer technologists, it's kind of like the black and white, and so you have to bring them into that kind of grayscale level of information.
I mean, yeah, I think it's not only easy, it's unavoidable. I guess what's interesting to me about the mashup model is that even when you're working alone, you're collaborating, right? So I think that for, you know, I don't want to be establish some kind of generational politics here, but I think that it's sort of very natural in a way, and there's not a lot of anxiety about this question of collaboration. It's just sort of there.
Mm-hmm. And we have been talking during different sessions about how different ways of imagining the city exist in there, from the more collective imagination that Teddy was talking yesterday about, and how the neighborhood can become the real lab for experimentation, to other more technocratic and up-bottom approaches. What is your position on those? Would you frame yourself? Would you relate to those?
I mean, I guess I've been going last, I'll go first this time. I mean, that's one of the hardest ones. I have because of the work on the Atlantic Yards project, like, you know, you get tagged with this label, community planner, community designer, community something, which is no offense to anyone in the room who happens to, you know, ascribe to that label, but it's one I don't ascribe to. And so there's always this, you know, because I'm a designer, I don't know anything about community. I've been locked in my studio for the past 20 years. So there's this question of how to still engage with communities, right? Even if and see what the things that we do can offer in helping them, you know, do the things that they either want or need to do. And that's not necessarily just kind of providing a service and sort of giving them what they want, but also challenging them to think beyond what it is they already know. So there was that diagram with the, you know, with the three scales: the skyscraper, the row houses, and the warehouse, and that was a diagram, for example, that we used, that we devised basically to have a discussion with, you know, community activists about who were basically saying we want brownstone Brooklyn, we don't want Manhattanization, we don't want skyscrapers, and we said, look around your neighborhood, you already have all these scales, right? And so if we open our minds a little bit and we think more flexibly, we can actually come up with something which addresses the heterogeneity that already exists. So I'm probably getting a little bit off of your question, but there's this, you know, that I think is one of the challenges and struggles of how we are one player within a collectivity that is outside of us, but I think we can become a more central actor within that notion of a collective. If not the controller, we can have influence. I think that's a more interesting idea than how do we control anything.
And I just kind of want to go back to the idea of the visualization. I think earlier today, I think it was Maybelle Wilson talked about Google tapping into Africa earlier today, and saying that there's people are not using the internet in that sense in Africa. And there's actually a visualization, I'm sure people have seen it, in which there's a globe, and Google has actually shown kind of these glowing streaks at city cores. And what was kind of alarming was in Africa it was very faint, or there weren't any glowing streaks at all. And in the rest of the world, you know, there's these kind of sharp glowing shoots off the city cores. So in that response, like when you see this globe and you see this kind of fireball of glowing streaks, and then you see this kind of landmass in Africa that is pretty much blacked out, then you begin to realize, oh my gosh, there's not much technology used in this sense. And so it's this idea to kind of, as I was mentioning before, getting the immediate reaction of the public and to bring it to a sense at a level that a lot of people could understand, right? Like the bare minimum right away.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very relevant problem. People who don't have access to the platforms from which they can do this. I guess I can only speak about people who do. And for me, it's not a question of how do we engage with communities. It's a question of how communities engage with us. So if we look at, say, the iPhone that controls the bike, you know, allows you to, it's a personal device. It's helping you meet up with friends on the go, or if you care about the environment and the pollution you ride through, then it's helping you personally do that. At the same time, the ability to share that data with the city, you know, you get this kind of aggregate information. And I think that's one way of, and it's transparent information, so citizens can still act, can still access that. That's one way to think of a platform that allows people to come from the bottom up, especially if it's open source and you can write your own applications for your own bike. It allows people to come from the bottom up, but also if they wish to participate, then you know you have this kind of ability to give to the top levels as well, so all levels.
Yeah, I think that was also really interesting when you were provoking us with this idea of open source design and what that could mean for the future of urbanism if everybody is, as we were listening yesterday, an author, what that means. I think
there's going to have to be a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of problems in this as well. Privacy is a big one. Engaging data, I mean, that's a huge topic in itself. So one thing is, you know, the tools, one thing is the privacy, one thing is how do you bring people together to work with this stuff?
In one essence, you're also becoming a developer too, like with the open source. As you were talking about before, you have to learn their language and how to kind of bring that to a new medium. So it's not just only designing with on paper and trace, but actually kind of getting that medium or that understanding or that language.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to clarify a little bit. Though I have had some experiences and still have experiences with things like participatory planning, which I think is a great field with a long and very important history. I, as many do, have reservations about it in terms of how, in terms of what it produces, you know, and so for me, I think the questions I'm asking are less about, you know, how we create more agency for quote unquote everyday people in terms of creating some incredible website or Google group where they can plug in every desire they ever had about their neighborhood and we can run it through a script and generate a thing. You know, I'm actually, for me, I'm looking more inward at our field and figuring out how we can explode outward more, right? How we can, you know, rather than trying to turn the collective into a sort of singular author, I'm interested in how we turn the singular author into something more open, broader, more, yeah, more.
So I guess as a way of wrapping up, what do you see when you look?
It's kind of like he mentioned before with the idea of public consultation, right? Now, public consultation and open houses for cities or neighborhood designs. If you bring in these kind of new technologies now, it's not just the sense of, you know, dropping in your base map and creating these designs. Now you have the actual opportunity, as you were mentioning before, creating these kind of animations or future predictions that could be changed by engaging these kind of, I guess, urban types of data that normally are not shown, right? And typically it could be things that lay out the kind of fundamental or urban envelope for that specific site. Like the kind of the works that we were doing too, in particular, we're saying, okay, can it just be for city works or city scale levels? And one aspect with this kind of datascaping thing was even taking, for example, like new urbanists approach, right? And looking at the edge from the sidewalk, right, to the edge of the porch and its setback, what would that kind of single unit housing, what would that landscape look like? And then if you multiply that with that whole area, then in itself it becomes this kind of strange collection of tiny landscapes merged into one big urbanist form. So it has a variety of, I guess, opportunities that doesn't necessarily have to work, I guess, in its own singular sense, but a collective sense as well. And I think the idea of even bringing this for the general public is very important because with that expertise about imaging and design backgrounds, I think it's a way to kind of really bring it forth to a whole broad audience.
I guess my last question for each of you, in a question mode, let's say, your desire for the future of urbanism? What do you see? What challenge you are just ready to take? How do you envision just your next steps moving forward? Because, I mean, you're a pretty young panel, I would say, so we are really interested in knowing what is going on and how do you see things happening, next projects coming? How do you envision that?
It starts with me, okay. Well, I think there's a danger with technology to kind of blanket it over everything and have a one application fits all or a one process fits all. For me, the kind of next thing is how do we actually tap into specific problems in specific cities and work with technology to address those in unique and novel ways that bring in people and understand culturally who they are. That's where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying too. Is each kind of situation and scales have its own kind of way that you pay certain attentions to, and again, technology is good too. I really am for it, but you have to kind of balance between what you show and what you don't show, and certain applications of it. So. The future, of course, now you could almost, there was this idea we were talking about before is, you know, right now we have these models and we have these animations, but pretty soon we'll probably be in design schools where you're actually immersed into the environment. So it becomes like holograms in some cases, right? So you have to kind of even begin to sense, wow, like it becomes a real virtual reality of the space. And so you can even begin to kind of craft that type of data for that kind of scenarios in a virtual reality datascape or a virtual reality urban city.
I mean, I guess my hope or aspiration for or prediction or prescription for the future of urbanism as a discourse would be that we get over some of the conceptual, aesthetic, technical kind of bigotries that sort of pervade what we do. Whether it's, you know, it's always this kind of inability to be able to transition from, you know, whether it be everyday urbanism to new urbanism to Manhattanism to landscape urbanism, et cetera, when in fact it all belongs to all of us. and it's all available to all of us, and it's more of a question of looking at each part of the discourse and figuring out how we put the different pieces together and figure out what's valuable to work in the many different situations which we'll confront.
So I guess we are perfect in time. Thanks so much again for your presentations and the talk.